Okay, in this movie, we're going to give a brief overview and an introduction into the reading comprehension section, the overall approach to reading the reading passages, and we're also going to go in depth into one specific aspect of that approach, which is looking at the perspectives that are present in every single reading passage. Okay, so in terms of an overall approach, basically as an overall approach to doing the passages, to reading the passages, is that you need to read them critically. So you need to practice developing a rich visual and conceptual structure as you're reading, and not just sounding out the words in your head. And you need to pay attention to the relationships between the sentences amongst themselves and their relationship to the passage as a whole. And understanding the arguments is critical. Remember, you're reading for structure. So if you need to, review the argument structure lesson in the beginning of the arguments section. Now, in order to have a good understanding of the passage that will allow you to best answer the questions, there are 4 key things that you need to focus on as you're reading the passage. And the first thing you need to pay attention to is perspectives. Each passage is going to present the points of views or perspectives of anywhere from 2 or more groups or individuals, including the author of the passage, and it's concerning the topic of the passage. Next, you need to pay attention to oppositions or conflict. The perspectives of the different groups will generally be in conflict or in opposition. They'll have different evaluations and attitudes towards the subject in question. Next, you need to pay attention to the tone. The different groups will present their perspectives in language that conveys emotions. And then you need to pay attention to structure. The passage can be understood as an extended argument with the author's main point acting as the conclusion, and the perspectives, oppositions, and tone all act together to manifest the structure of this argument. So in addition to the things mentioned above, you also need to keep in mind that the passages will generally have a certain amount of information that is presented, usually at the very beginning, that acts as background or context for the rest of the passage. Okay, so let's take a closer look at perspectives. So what's the basic information behind these perspectives? Now, as mentioned, the passages will generally provide you with a certain amount of information at the very beginning to provide context for the arguments in the rest of the passage. And the basic organizing principle for every reading passage is that the author will present multiple perspectives concerning the subject of the passage. Now, this makes sense since the actual practice of the law is based on a judge evaluating between contending perspectives in a courtroom, or jurors evaluating contending perspectives from witnesses, or several lawyers representing the contending interests of their clients in a negotiation, etc. Now, not every perspective will have equal representation. The author's perspective is always one of the contending perspectives and is the one that ties everything together. Now, the author might be more sympathetic to some of the perspectives, and some of the perspectives will be given more importance and space to elaborate their positions. And some of the perspectives will be presented from a biased standpoint, that of the author or that of another group. Okay, so looking at it in the actual passage. Perspectives are generally found at the beginning of the passage, and they establish the main fault lines of the argument, but they're also found throughout the entire passage as main characters refine and elaborate their positions. Now, the first basic variation is where the author presents views of a certain group and then says that there's something wrong with that position. And this generally happens in the first paragraph, with the views of the group coming first and the author's perspective at the very end of the first paragraph, or even at the beginning of the second. And the perspectives that appear throughout the rest of the passage are generally those of the group or the author, and are related to overarching positions that are established at the beginning of the passage and function to further elaborate and develop those positions. The second basic variation is where the author presents several perspectives concerning a topic, but doesn't directly challenge any of them. And the number of perspectives starts at 2, but can easily be 3, 4, 5, or even more. And the perspectives can be further grouped together and contrasted with one another. And the author may ultimately most closely identify with one perspective, or they may simply draw a conclusion that in some way incorporates an analysis of all the different perspectives. So as you're reading, pay attention to sentences that introduce groups or individuals. So for example, legal scholars specializing in international law have maintained that. So you see, legal scholars is the group that has a particular perspective. The consensus among literary critics has been, once again, literary critics is the group we're looking at. With recent advances in technology, marine biologists have begun to change their opinions concerning. Mark Twain always considered his early piece of journalism. So there's always going to be a group or an individual presented that has a particular perspective, a particular view. Then you should note their perspective and the reasoning that is used to support that perspective. Also, note the relationship between different perspectives. In general, the relationship will be one of opposition, so look for points of conflict. And pay attention to the author's voice. The author's perspective won't be as obviously articulated, but learn to identify those sentences where the author evaluates or makes an assessment concerning the perspective or supporting argument of one of the groups. And it's helpful to diagram. You can circle the words that identify the group and underline their basic point.